My name is Glenn Davidson. I was Canada's ambassador to Syria from 2008 until 2012. It was a period that was enormously interesting for me and for my family because we were able to see Syria in a time of peace as relations were warming up with the West and as there was some grounds for optimism. We watched that then degenerate and we saw the whole process of Syria's gradual descent into the current terrible civil war begin and develop, and I stayed in Syria until we deemed that the security situation was such that it was no longer safe for our people to be there, and we closed the embassy in March of 2012. So I'm very happy to share a few personal thoughts today. I'll reflect on the humanitarian crisis that the people of Syria are facing and the impact of this on the migration issues to which the whole international community is responding. Let me just say first, I make no apology for stating the obvious at the outset, but the reason that there is a humanitarian crisis, of course, is because there is a civil war, and that humanitarian crisis will continue as long as the fighting goes on in Syria. Very difficult to stop that right now, and I think this is an important point to bear in mind as we talk about the specifics of the humanitarian crisis and the migration issues. After 5 years, sides are entrenched. The sponsors that are supporting the people that are doing the fighting are very dug in as well, and what we see then is circumstance where it's very difficult for people to come to terms with the cessation of hostilities, potentially on terms which are not to their advantage. So I'm glad that talks are underway now. I'm hopeful that there'll be positive results from these talks because that's what eventually has to happen. But I'm not optimistic that we'll see a cessation of hostilities and that we'll see the means by which the humanitarian crisis can start to come to an end. This may be with us for some substantial time. Second point I would offer is that as always in a war, it's innocent civilians that are victims of this. And the scale of this in Syria right now is hard to comprehend. When I arrived in Syria, there were about 22 million people. Today, it's estimated that about 11 million, so half the total population, are displaced. 7 million internally within the country, over 4 million in the adjacent countries. This is a colossal humanitarian issue, and it's one that I'm going to try to help to understand a little bit over the next couple of minutes. The countries immediately around Syria are bearing an enormous and in many cases an unsupportable burden. Lebanon, with a population of about 4 million, has well over 1 million Syrian refugees. Jordan has 750,000 or so. Turkey has 2 million clustered around the border. And the United Nations and the non-government organizations that are doing heroic efforts to try to support these people are massively underfunded. So this is one of the contributing factors to the humanitarian crisis, the sheer numbers of people overwhelming the resources of the countries that are hosting them and underfunding of the United Nations and the NGOs that are trying to help out as well. I met many Syrian people, and I traveled extensively throughout the entire country, and I will honestly say I've never met more gracious or welcoming or kind people than I did in my travels throughout Syria. So these are ordinary people that desperately need assistance from the international community. And my sense is that the international community needs to do much more. And I believe this takes several parts. The first, obviously, is coming to grips with a serious effort to broker peace in the Syrian civil war. And this is something that the people that are fighting within Syria themselves are not able to address. It has to be, in large measure, the countries that are sponsoring the fighting and supporting them that have to help out with this as well. Second, the countries in the region and the international community at large need to do much more to help the United Nations and the NGOs. They need to be much more generous with the funding, and I believe that countries in the Gulf region in particular could do far more. Third, the regional supporting countries need assistance. They need bilateral assistance and support, not just for accommodation. They also need it, and not just for food. They also need it for education for children. There are hundreds of thousands of children in these refugee camps who desperately need hope, they need education, they need something to look forward to other than despair. So this is an enormous obligation as well. And lastly, on the subject of migration specifically, I think it's very, very important to note that the great bulk of the people, Syrian people who are in the camps and who are displaced, really don't want to go to another country. This is profoundly important. They really want to go home. They want to pick up their lives. They want to get back in business. They want to resume farming. And they want to establish normal lives in their own country with their own culture. There are, however, many for whom this is impossible for a variety of reasons who have to leave. And I think that, therefore, countries like Canada, Western European countries that are being generous in the support for refugees have an enormous role to play. Let me close these very brief remarks by simply offering a thought on Canada's response. I have no partisan interest in this whatsoever, but let me just say that the national response from the Government of Canada over these past several months has been a model, in my view, for the international community's response. If you look at the points that I offered earlier in terms of support for the United Nations and the NGOs, bilateral support to the countries in the region, Canada stepped up very, very generously, and I think that this is, as I said, a model for the whole international community. So I'm delighted with this and very proud of what we're doing. And secondly, the response of the Canadian people themselves to this refugee crisis, to the humanitarian crisis in Syria, has been more than heartwarming. It's been inspiring. Little communities, big cities, areas around the country where there are financial difficulties of their own have all come forward, opened their hearts, opened their pockets, and opened their communities to people who are desperately in need of help. So this is it's a wonderful thing. It makes me very proud to be Canadian. It makes me very proud of Canada. The need is great, and I know that we'll continue to come forward with this. So with that, let me say thank you to Canada, thank you to Canadian citizens who are helping out, and I'm very grateful for the chance to share these thoughts with you this afternoon.